The Polish Grom has been fighting a secret war. Our enemies aren't human. Part 1. Written by The Forest Has Eyes. War should never be seen as a way of life, only as a dark era that we must push through. If we get too comfortable, it will consume us. That's something that my old squad leader told me a very long time ago. Back when I was in the conventional land forces, before I made the jump to our Special Forces operations community. Today, well, I'll get right to it. My name is Blahowicz, and I'm a member of the Polish Special Forces. More specifically, the unit known only as the Polish Grom, or JW Grom. A little background for some of you. We are the lineal force based off the silent, unseen paratroopers from my home country's resistance during the Second World War. In the modern era, Grom has become one of NATO's most elite units in our efforts alongside the American and British forces in the multi-decade global war on terror. Me, personally? Well, as of the time of writing this, I've been in the Polish Armed Forces for just over 12 years. A solid decade of which I've spent as a member within Grom itself. I've done 2 tours abroad in Afghanistan. However, the part that's relevant today is my time spent combating the menace that we are now fighting tooth and nail at home. We operate in anti-human trafficking operations. It pains me to say, but today, Poland has an epidemic problem with human trafficking that has spread from places such as Hungary, Romania, Belarus, and Russia. It's modern-day slavery, pure and simple, and the evil that I have uncovered whilst fighting this pestilence has shook me to my core. When you gaze upon 100 innocent souls, dead, who spent their final moments on this earth, tortured, mutilated, and afraid, well, you learn that there is no limit to the kind of sin that man will commit against itself for gain. That is why I do not stop, why I will always keep going, and why I will always carry our flag on my shoulder. However, marching through the circles carved by monsters living amongst us led me to something that I never dreamed of. Up until now, you're probably wondering why I've told you all of this, including my name, shattering the heritage of silent professionalism over my knee. It's because NATO has been fighting a secret war for decades, and our enemies aren't human. They don't bleed, and they assimilate all of us. The danger I found in the 10th Circle, corroded and formed by humanity's greed, led me to find a hidden danger that is existential and real. The worst part is, I don't know if we're winning, but we have to try. Let me start from the beginning. The fight against human trafficking is multi-layered. It is a complex, horribly adapting foe that will never rest. An average of 25 million people every year are exploited by this modern servitude, kidnapped, threatened into a silent surrender. And an average of 70,000 per day are done so through airports right in front of your eyes. Blending in, unable to ask for help, eyes forced forward. You would never know. Our enemies are resourceful and cunning. And as such, the forces at work include intelligence, federal special agents, and local police forces. And finally, if all of them are unable to neutralize a threat, extract the imprisoned, then the members of the JW Grom are called upon. If all else fails, it is up to us. These operations could be planned in advance, but 60% were always snap missions that were done under emergency circumstances, with little time to prepare, so we must always stay ready. My experience as a highly efficient team leader and my dedicated use of our methodology of violence of action is what had me on the roster for any of these snap response forces. More recently, about a month ago, the event that caught our eye was the activity of a group that had been operating near the eastern border of Podlaski. The call came at around 0200, earlier than even we wake up to start our day. Usually, these alerts would be met with a bit of quip. A jovial attitude goes a long way to help the process of being woken up in the graveyard hours to be told that you're going to go assault through hell for the 3rd time this month. Yet, my old captain was having none of it. He had been around. He'd been a part of the 03 invasion, rotated through Afghanistan enough times to call it a second home. Heck, he'd even been part of Eagle's Feather. But his tone sounded tense. I had never seen him have to hide nerves before.
"Head on in. Only lead staff. Don't be late,"
he said. I started to wake up. Already, years of indoctrinated muscle memory had me halfway through my wake-up routine as I remember groggily asking, "Everything, sir?" The only answer I got was a shaky half inhale and
"No."
Needless to say, I drove in a little faster than I had previously. The walk through our unit's staging area at this time of the day always felt unique, exclusive. The accumulation of a decade of hard work earning me the right to be a part of the upper echelon of my craft. Yet all I felt in that moment was being totally left out. And for the first time in a long time, I felt nervous. Though that didn't stop me from smothering it as much as I could with caffeine and focus. You could feel it. We face life-threatening bodily injury and death every single mission that we go on. But something was off about this one. It always felt like this when it came to traffickers, leeches, vermin right on our home front. Sometimes our own countrymen, kidnapping our own people and shipping them off to God knows where to do unspeakable things for wretched people, or worse. A laptop and projector was already set up per these briefings. I was right about my captain because the man rolled in more pressed than I had seen him during firefights. I mean, that's not hard. We excel in that environment. But that means that we were all out of our element on this one. He set a folder down and got right to it. The National Police had been tracking several suspect individuals that had come through Poland utilizing fake identities, operating on the trafficking network that ran into Poland through Germany from the Netherlands. I don't envy the Dutch, by the way. When it comes to it, that place is a festering hive for trafficking. Anyways, the National Police had realized that something was up on 2 main factors. The first is these men and women managed to navigate and get around multiple points of surveillance and egress in days when diverting around back roads would have taken them weeks. The second part is because they were dead, or at least on paper. This caused several of us to blink. I steeled myself as I composed my voice and chirped up, could you expand that, sir?" The captain's eyebrows were furrowed, locked in place as he explained. All of them, upwards of 12 suspects in total. A woman amongst them had been registered dying of a stroke almost 3 months prior. In Scotland, 2 of the men were found dead. New Delhi, Romania, Hungary, Serbia. He opened the folders and showed all of us photos of them lying dead after having been stabbed, shot, mugged, strangled. The guy from Serbia died of kidney failure. And yet, there they were, verifiable on photographic evidence, and yet, in videographic evidence that they were up and moving. How their passports and visas got approved, How they got through, I don't know. Neither did the captain or MI. The few grainy images that we had of them passing through some bus stations and traffic stops, well, they looked identical, albeit it was hard to tell from the footage, but it definitely looked like them. I thought at the time that maybe it was just knowing that they were technically listed as dead that tipped off my uncanny valley sixth sense. I would be so very wrong. Following this, the National Police planned and organized a raid on a small inn that they were believed to be using as a control point and safe house. It was located in Podlaski, deep in rural East Poland. What followed was, well, we were oh so very lucky that it was isolated in the rural woods. The captain opened up a folder and passed out several images. Highly graphic death portraits from the aftermath. The exact information of the events is limited because 86% of the police assigned to that raid were killed. The police task force of several dozen policemen and women descended upon the inn under the cover of darkness with a helicopter acting as their overwatch. The helicopter itself had thermal imaging to help accurately mark anyone on the property. It's through this helicopter that we received all of the videos and live chatter of the raid. The police secured the main road, leaving only a small dirt road leading to the rustic dark brown inn, and the dense wood at its rear. Half of the force approached from the road while the other half was assigned to the forest. The police approached with guns drawn. Overwatch reported no personnel outside nor any visible windows open. The line was quiet. You could see the tense, slow yet smooth approach of the dozens of heat signatures of the police officers as they crept through the woods. Then, one of their signatures stopped. Overwatch zoomed in on the police officer to see that he seemed to be struggling with something, some sort of cold signature. Then the struggling turned into gunfire as the officer began to fire off shots as they fought for control of their weapon. Then, with several strikes, their head was nearly removed from their body. Transcripts of the radio traffic describe the National Police reporting immediate casualties upon encircling the back half of the inn within a 50-meter radius. At the same time, the road personnel quickly rushed to descend upon the front and reported no contact. The bird quickly maneuvered as Overwatch was having a hard time giving accurate intel. As signatures of the National Police were dropping left and right after coming into contact with these cold signatures. Spots on their screen that came up colder than the autumn air around them. Cold spots with the rough silhouettes of humans. The captain showed several screenshots of what looks to be one of them being struck with a punch, and the brutal display in ISR of a policeman's innards flying across the forest. Yet the road personnel received no contact at all and made entry into the inn. The images were varied. Entire walls of the building had been crudely torn down, bashed apart, or dug into, leaving the layout to be a messy kill house in which the National Police reportedly then took fire. They say took fire because the first member of the stack had a hole the size of a grapefruit punched through their chest and their body armor. The National Police reported returning fire at personnel. However, no bodies were found. All the while, the forest personnel continued to be slaughtered, mistakenly firing at the inn, believing that it was the source of any sort of attack and causing subsequent cases of fratricide. The floor of the majority of the first floor was a sickening mix of what was found later to be fecal matter and human gore. It was described as a 200-meter biohazard. The first floor also seemed to be the holding section. A mountain of 27 bodies, all of them shoved messily, violently, into garbage bags of people that had expired on the way to the inn. Or worse, filled the corner of the inn's L-shaped architecture. Many of them were nearly hollow. Some organs were removed, but it was noted that specifically all of the blood had been drained, and all of the bones had the majority of their marrow removed through what was described as canine and human teeth and gnash marks on their limbs, bodies, torsos, and the spine. The second floor had holes in it, as it seemed the sheer putrid nature of it caused it to literally burn holes through it as it seeped down, showing signs of the lack of maintenance or care by the occupants. The primary center of that extraction seemed to have taken place on the second floor, where they left many of the hollow corpses on meat hooks. It was brutal. The most recently deceased were several tourists. They had tracked them snagging from West Poland just days prior. They had had their throats ripped out. Emergency medical personnel that arrived on the scene calculated that it happened no sooner than the raid starting, meaning that they had performed such a brutal task under fire whilst being surrounded, worst of all. No suspects or culprits were found. The forest was searched, limbs, ribs, gore from the police was found everywhere, and yet not one single suspect had been found. It was one of the worst failures in our fight against trafficking, and the world knew nothing, because how could we tell them? It's then that the captain ended that catch-up, but letting us know that Grom had been greenlit for a raid. I'm not gonna lie, after all that, dozens wounded, permanently out of action, others dead, torn apart by whatever those things were, my blood ran cold. Our intelligence services proved their worth as they came back immediately with an accurate target package. We narrowed down the possible locations for a fallback point and found one. It was near the region of Lubuskia in Poland's southeast. Just an hour outside of Luko was a meat locker and storage plant adjacent to a small, now defunct rail yard, both abandoned over 18 years ago. 50 meters long, single metal building with a small auxiliary tower previously used overlooking the desolate clearing filled with old rail cars. The cars had been left abandoned for over a decade and a half. Some trains ran through there, but very few stopped. Its proximity to lesser-known roads and one main route just south of the dirt path made it an excellent place for contacts, and escorting traffickers to discreetly leave buses and walk down the forest road, vans to pull off or, if they were bold enough, transport anyone using rail cars that they were smuggling in. NATO has always won by defeating its enemy in detail. We've followed this philosophy even before our country's ascension into the Alliance. Grom is known as the Surgeons for a reason. Electronic warfare personnel attached to us deployed dragonfly-sized drones alongside utilizing thermal capabilities. Intelligence was the key to success. Knowing what you are doing was key. Initial identification of the area before our arrival showed several figures outside the main entrance to the meat locker building itself, with a few more at the train depot. Had you not known the reality of this, you would have thought that it was simply another day. The bastards were masquerading among us, we were about to give them one hell of a wake-up call. The thing that creeped me out, however, was them reporting several figures standing sporadically throughout the woods. The windy winter day meant their heat signatures lit up well, and from their posture, they seemed to somehow not only know the drone was there, but were staring at it. Any attempt to lock on or zoom in were unsuccessful, and they were gone. Support relegated it to equipment issues in cold temperatures. If only they had been more careful. The raid was launched later in the day. Despite the evidence that this group had a distinct advantage at night, we were second to none in the dark. Utilizing a period of high traffic coming down the road, 2 vans comprising of my element, First Squad, along with the Second Squad, would secure the entrance to the building as well as the area around it. Third Squad would cleverly arrive on the train scheduled to arrive at the depot. From what I got told, not all of the trains that passed through were aligned with the traffickers. It was their way of hiding in plain sight, and it would be our weapon to utilize against them. Additionally, we had a marksman acting as overwatch set up on a transmission tower to give us extra eyes on the tower and windows of the complex. Due to the lack of elevated terrain in the forest in any actionable area, he had to set up on the tower approximately half a click away from the target. Regardless, this guy had performed some nasty shots and even secured a JSOC record or 2. So, if anyone was going to give us clean intel and cover, it was him. Coordinating our approach from the road with the arrival of the train, we were set to initiate our assault at the exact same time. The surreal experience of being in a concealed van, especially during a high-mobility raid like this, is something you have to experience. The drivers fully kitted out, tearing it down the road while the cordon tried to give us the clearest route as we all held on in the back. These vans were designed for this, custom fitted with the proper seating and handrails. That being said, the swerve off of the highway as the driver turned onto the rough dirt road to the site definitely had us swaying. I could hear chatter from our command in my headset.
Building element has left Public Avenue. 13 seconds to target. Rail element nearing target. 15 seconds to target. Overwatch to main. I have eyes on personnel in the tower.
From what I could gather, our boy sitting up in the metal tower, freezing winds cutting through every lair he had on, kept to his duty. He reported that he could see a figure keeping watch on the main road that we were driving down.
I have eyes on one of our missing deads.
Then, even through the adrenaline of us nearing our target, what he said next made my heart launch directly into my throat.
Target is appearing as a cold signature.
Without a second thought, command ordered,
Overwatch, you are green.
Then things got odd.
Overwatch to main. Light within the building has disappeared. Possibly a short circuit. Main to Overwatch. What is the status on the suspect individual within the tower? Main to Overwatch. Do you successfully read my last? Roger Main, the suspect individual vanished the second the shot was initiated.
I really wished at that moment that they didn't give me access to those comms. I get why all of the leaders were on them, transparency and the flow of information, but still, nothing made my blood run cold like that entire thing. I looked at some of my men, staring at me for guidance. All I could do was white-knuckle my MK-18 and prepare for what was to come. Our nation needed us to be a hammer against the dark, and my men needed me to be an impermeable wall of focus. And that was what I was going to be. our fast mobility vans quickly tore into the gravel parking lot in front of the meat locker, the doors sliding open. My squad's van was parked further away while second squads peeled in closer. They were the cordon element for the building. They didn't hesitate or fail to be the fastest among us, as I've always known them to be. With light now quickly disappearing, we had our night vision down. The pitch black of the lightless forest site around us was bathed in a white and light blue sheen. Every centimeter was revealed to us, giving our foes nowhere to hide. I led my squad out, our PEQ lasers quickly scanning the surrounding area as we pushed fast towards the front of the building. Operators from the second squad wasted no time. There were 2 men from the cell that we were hunting. Bearded, wearing dirty jackets and pants, showing that they had been there for a while. But most importantly, fear. They looked afraid as our nation's finest surrounded them, dragging them into the dirt and ordering their silence in harsh whispers as our barrels were to their skin. Even so, I caught wind of some of their panicked babbling. "You don't understand. You can't go in there. You'll never come out." The hiss of a train's brakes broke the silence of the area. To the east, across about 100 meters of parked train cars, left to rot in a disgusting maze of lanes and death corners, was a concrete platform where it seemed a regular freighter was coming in to refuel. The guards that stood on the platform were nowhere near ready when the door slid open and third squad emerged, yelling instead of whispering. With the outside area secured, second squad's lead called in. "Condition white." I motioned for my breacher to prepare a charge, a pre-made strip of demo charge made to blow the locks off a conventional door. I knew that the garage doors would either be locked tight or rusted shut. And so we were prepared. The due diligence of my squad and I ensured that nothing was going to stop us. He placed the charge onto the entrance and hit the activator. There was a hiss of electricity racing towards the explosives as all of us pushed back around the corners. Just as always, look away and exhale. The shake of the blast snapped everyone's senses awake and alive. I led from the front as my squad split in 2. We flowed through the door and into the breach as any ambient light quickly faded into total darkness, making our nods our lifeline against whatever vicious defenders were inside. We pushed through, a methodical rush as we cleared what was a large open room stretching from one end of the building to the other. Between the shadows that smothered us and the putrid, gag-inducing stench of rot, I don't know what was worse. Rusted and decrepit workstations and machines forming a labyrinth of dead space and kill corners. All needed to be cleared, and every single one had to be navigated uniquely. All the whilst we were trying not to drop any security against an enemy that we all remembered tearing apart those officers on ISR. Tensions were high, to say the least. As we neared the end of our sweep of the ground floor, there were no signs of anything. Then one of my men, my breacher who was right behind me, whispered, "This place is inactive, right?" I looked over, a bit confused, then I saw what was undoubtedly causing this smell. Right there in plain sight. Yet we had been too busy securing the building to notice. On different parts of the machine, dripping down onto the floor to create a horrid septic sludge on different parts of the floor were organs, slabs of meat, steaming in the cold air and left out to rot and putrefy. Effing hell is all I could get out as we neared the end of the long stretch that was the ground floor, only to hear one of my men from the left round a particularly large machine running perpendicular to the floor, acting as a wall, yell, Hands! 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 I sprinted as fast as I could, the whole squad closing in as we pushed through the last. Standing near a series of doors, facing the back wall of the building, was an individual. Old white wool traditional clothing stained in. I don't want to know what. It was dark, steam coming off of it. He had a hand against the wall, bracing him as he spat out gore onto the floor. He stood up, turning towards us. He stared at everyone, and then at me. An old gray beard on a worn, tan face, cuts and scars lining his skin as he stood upright facing me. His eyes, they reflected. Eyes aren't supposed to reflect. I was so entranced, stunned. I was so mentally staggered by this that I barely noticed him reach into one of his pockets and draw out a handgun. Small, square, it was a Glock. There was no mistaking it. Possibly a 17 or 19 depending on the sides. These were details I remembered as one of my men and I fired into him, tearing apart the front of his chest as he fell to the ground. Immediately, we pushed towards the last set of rooms, actual locker units themselves. As we did so, me and two of my men stopped. The two men flipped him over, zip-cuffing his hands as I cleared his weapon. It actually was a Glock 17, Gen 4. I guess that my perception isn't lacking with age or with stress. Then the sounds of sprinting from upstairs could be heard, causing several of my men pulling rear security to aim, trying to find the source of the running. Nothing could be seen. Then, from below, there was a scream, deep and guttural. Nothing that a human could let loose, and I swear that my ribs and organs were shaking from the sound. I quickly bagged the gun as evidence. It was then that Overwatch reported in.
Overwatch to main. I just caught sight of a cold signature sprinting past the catwalk windows. I say again, there are cold signatures inside of the building.
I froze cold, analyzing everything around me. My breacher worked to pry open the meat locker doors, whilst some of the others still scanned the empty catwalks for any signs of life. I looked up and around. Nothing. It was clear that whatever we had done had backed them into a corner. Second squad was still clearing the outside with third squad. Until then, we were on our own. The building was our objective, and we had to secure it. The snap of metal and of a handle falling to the floor told me that my men had breached into the lockers, and honestly, I wish we hadn't. Dark red organic material poured out from the floor the second that we opened it, mimicking stains on the floor that at first glance you would have thought was just rust. Inside the room, blood, bile, hooks hanging from a small square room as human remains were stacked like bricks, neatly organized, processed. This sight caused a pause in everyone on the team, all of us double-taking as we looked at each other, each look asking, is this really what we're seeing right now? And yeah, it was. I looked down at the floor. The blood seemed to stick to our boots, and as I lifted up to take a look at the underside, I swear that I could see whatever parasitic compound was in it leech off it like tendrils, reaching at anything. I quickly dragged and then kicked it all off onto the metal floor, muttering, "Don't let any of this touch you." The adrenaline in my system caused my hand to shake as I grabbed my push to talk.
Bravo 2 to main. Ground floor secure. Sit rep as follows. 1. EKIA. Over 12 cadavers inside of the meat lockers at the northeast side end.
There was a long moment, uncharacteristic of a talk, as they undoubtedly processed this.
Maine to Bravo 2-1. Good copy. Are you able to continue onto the subterranean objective?
I thought of all the people who had been killed, everyone that these monsters had taken, and everything that we had just seen between the two doors of this cursed building. I looked to the basement door.
Roger, Maine. Element maneuvering down.
We quickly reached the door adjacent to the locker as one of my men pulled it open, the others flowing in to reveal a small open area just before a stone stairwell leading down into the depths. The second we did this, we heard them. A voice, which was probably supposed to be a female in her mid-20s, spoke. Her words were forced together, and it felt like someone was puppeteering her. "You're hiding behind all of that equipment. We can see you thrice as clearly as you believe that you can see us." My uncanny valley meter was off the charts, as more of them, all the same genre of effed up meat puppets, continued to scream from the impermeable darkness below. "Die, die, die. Come down here. Come and join us. We won't let you take them from us." Far below, a concrete floor and shadowy doors was all that I and my men could see. In a delicate situation that came with traffickers and hostages, which required scalpable means, a negotiable approach was needed every time. We didn't know what they were, but if it meant that even one person who was still down there could be saved, then we needed to try. "You will release the hostages and proceed with your hands up now," I yelled, only for the snap of a gunshot to echo tremendously off the walls of the underground, zipping past us as we took fire. My gunner returned fire, shooting his belt fed back into the darkness and causing a horrific screech to emit. Well, I guess negotiations had failed. The member of my squad who had the ballistic shield, this heavy, bulky obstruction that weighed about as much as an engine block, quickly took to the front, and slowly we made our way down. As we did, suddenly the tension of everything let loose as we neared the middle of the stairwell. As from the darkness, we heard a set of footsteps, skin slapping on the concrete floor as a figure dead sprinted at us with no weapon. Her hair was dark, oily, ivory skin contrasting, reflective eyes. Immediately, she slammed into our shield barrier. This man, who was around 6.5 feet himself, built like a tank, carrying enough ballistic weave to stop a magazine, shook as this deranged, psychotic woman slammed into him. She clawed at the shield, and I could see some of the outer fabric and material rip off, as she seemed to toss him back over her shoulder. The hulking mass of SHIELD and Polish Army Special Forces might slamming into the bottom of the stairway. I didn't have any time to spare a thought for him as she immediately lunged at me. Her teeth, horribly jagged and deformed, snapped and snarled as I muzzle thumped her in the collarbone. Despite the forged steel barrel slamming into her bones, she didn't stop. Probably wouldn't have if my machine gunner hadn't opened fire. The 7.62 tearing apart her neck and shoulder, the parasitic blood from before flying onto one of the walls as she stumbled and fell back messily. We pushed past her, rifles raised as we quickly moved in to close in on our injured comrade. To his credit, he shrugged off the toss. That was until incoming fire from the adjacent door to our left, his front, caught him in the shoulder, causing him to scream. That is, before he was dragged out from behind through the door to our right. Move, move, move! I yelled. This was the cue for my squad that weapons were fully released and that it was time to either secure the area or die. Violence of action taking hold as my breacher and 3 of my squad peeled into the left room, gunfire emitting as my gunner and I flowed into the door to our right. What I saw gave me pause as 2 individuals, I can't call them human, stood over my fallen comrade. Pointed ears and skin pale to the point of being gray, jagged teeth cutting through and poking out of the torn flesh of their mouths. The second we entered, the one that had a grip on my shield man, white-knuckling his right arm, tore it off from its socket. He screamed bloody murder as his blood went flying about. The beast then tossed his limb at me as some sort of challenge. We answered. Gunfire erupted as we pushed forward, our gunner wasting no time in sawing one of them in half as my MK-18 struggled to put down that effing monster. His gaunt features and face seemed to smirk at me as he marched forward, as he raised his hands to try and grab me. His nails seemed to have been sharpened as his jagged bones poked from the flesh of his fingers, worn down past the point of no return. Yet finally, it fell to the ground. Quickly, my gunner pulled security as the battles from the other rooms continued. The fighting in the rooms to our left subsided as my men yelled and rushed for the 2 others. Meanwhile, I tried to comfort my soldier, placing a tourniquet and stopping the bleeding as best we could as we sat him up against the back wall. Then, as fighting began to occur in the room just across from us, the plaster and wood of the wall exploded, showering all 3 of us as one of my Grom operators was thrown straight through it. I could feel the air knocked out of him as he almost tripped me. Then, through the breach emerged a heftier one. The same gray, putrid skin lined his body, as muscles seemed to rip through the flesh at the surface. One of our comrades opened fire. Its reflective eyes scanned us like an apex predator as it tore more material from the wall and stepped through. Then all of us fired. I stepped off to the left, opening fire as my gunner did as well. I fired until I had to drop a mag and slap in a new one. I hit the bolt release home as it continued to try and walk towards us. Gray flesh and muscle tearing away as it seemingly walked towards us with no issue. Everyone was firing. Me, my gunner, the man that he had thrown had gotten his bearings, and just as he switched to full auto, he dumped whatever he had in his magazine into the thing. Even the shield bearer had managed to draw his pistol and fired. After emptying what seemed to be half of our mission load into it, it finally staggered, falling to the ground as its disgusting blood leaked onto the floor, and it still continued to crawl. It lunged forward, grabbing my ankle and squeezing with enough force to make me curse. That was until I fired the final shots that caved its skull in. After pulling my boot from its grip and kicking it in an unprofessional manner, I gazed around. The gunfire had ceased.
"First squad, status,"
I said. A chorus of voices called back. First my breacher.
"Room secured."
Then another.
"I've got 2 down here. Weapons secured. Anyone need aid?"
Our assigned CLS guy answered.
"I got 1 in this room."
I yelled back, and without hesitation he entered, nearly tripping on the hulking monster that we had just fought before kneeling before our shield bearer. Better days, huh? He quipped as the shield man shrugged, tilting his head. Then one of my men called out from the farthest back room. "Blahowicz, I need you here." After ordering the man thrown through the wall to stay with the other two, my gunner and I quickly headed over. As we entered, we had to keep from slipping on the blood or tripping over the bodies. The dead, some of the assailants that we had fought, but most people, lined the floor in messy, crude, cruel manners as two Grom operators stood amongst it. The multicam of their pants stained with the blood of the innocent as we gazed around. One of them nodded to me and then gestured over to the corner. There was one survivor, a girl, maybe 5 or 6. She sat shaking as her white dress was soaked in red blood. I quickly walked over, slinging my rifle as I flipped up my nods and pulled down my balaclava. Her gaze seemed to soften a bit once she saw I wasn't like the things that had captured her. Yet she still continued to remain in the corner. I quickly called it in.
Condition black, I say again. Condition black. Break.
I took a deep breath.
Bravo 2-1 to Maine. Prepare for sit rep. 1 wounded. Urgent. 8 EKIA. 1 hostage rescued.
Then, talk seemed to break form. I could hear a sigh over the net.
Repeat last. 1 hostage recovered. Roger, female, approximately 5 years old. Condition physically fine, heavily shaken.
With that, I picked her up and carried her out. The AAR was disturbing. Unlike previous missions where my men and I were tasked with securing everything, plans changed as another team from Grom immediately secured the scene. I remember barely walking out of that hellhole back to the open, clean air. Second Squad was shocked to see how much gore all of us were covered in. And then, immediately, the girl was scooped from my arms by a medical unit, and all of us were ordered to exfil. We were given a hefty amount of time off. 2 weeks of time to ourselves and our families, and nothing else. No true AAR, nothing. That was until I was told to meet at my command's office the next morning by a commander of a separate unit. I didn't know what to expect, but as always, I put on my uniform, cleaned myself up, and reported in. I entered the meeting room alone to see no one but a major, a smaller man. His hair swept back, stubble matching the piercing gaze he had looking out a window. He then looked at me. He quickly walked over, shaking my hand and commending me for your perseverance in that hellhole. Great work, Sergeant Blachowicz. All I could do was nod and thank him. However, the major whose name tag read Kroll waved off such formalities. The things that we are fighting won't wait for us to stand on ceremony. I knew what he was referring to, but I still asked. Things, sir? He then gestured to me to sit down, and then passed a folder and laid out everything. The bite marks seen on the bodies in the inn matched the dental reports from the combatants that you killed in Lukau. The temperature signatures of the cold targets were around the same as the bodies. The only warmth was from the rounds that you and your squad put into them. As little as 16, and in most cases, an entire magazine. The average human can only survive around 5 rounds, 8 maybe with body armor. Kroll's words caused a pit to form in my stomach. I knew that it had taken way too long to put any of those things down. You also collected and encountered blood from the site with unknown properties. He asked, his hands folded at his mouth, eyes staring deep into my soul. I could tell that all of the worries and theories that I had formed were also shared by this major. Yes, sir. Did you, get any on you? Any at all? No, sir. Major Kroll nodded at this. He slid the pictures away and showed me a dossier. A target package folder, not one specific person, but an entire group. He looked me in the eyes and said, "What you encountered there was a parasitic species that is utilizing the human trafficking network as a nervous system for their motives. A group that has existed in Europe for centuries, maybe even longer. Something that has plagued us ever since the Black Death reaped our lands." I raised an eyebrow, silently waiting as my hand slightly shook. Kroll pointed to the name on the top. "The current modern translation is Strigoi. My unit has been tasked with taking them out, and we are very experienced in combating them." Then questions formed, ones that the major didn't hesitate to answer. "So, why did my company get assigned and not you?" His response was nerve-wracking. "They've infiltrated everything. Tourism, transportation, probably even the police. Grom, for all it seems, remains vigilant and secured. However, politicians and administration that inform us and dispatch us, they are compromised as well. And they are likely to try and feed as many of us into a meat grinder as they could. However, luckily for us, our anchor remains one step ahead." Confused, I rubbed my eyes, trying to come to terms with all of this. The major offered me a cigarette, and I accepted it. "I don't want to drag too many of your men over. Compartmentalization has kept my unit secure. However, you had quite the career before walking into Lukau, and your experience in overcoming that darkness is invaluable. Our unit is underfunded, undersupported, not just due to infiltrators, but general paranoia, reasonable doubts, and those working with them." My eyes opened. "These things, they kill our people, they harvest them." Kroll gave an exhausted, jaded shrug. "Greed corrupts all. But regardless, I would like to bring you in, and hopefully more. We need to grow our base against this darkness. Besides, you're likely to be targeted because you killed so many." I sighed. It seemed that I didn't have a choice, and even then, what choice was there to make? These demons were targeting people, rounding them up like cattle and slaughtering them. They needed to be targeted. Someone had to make them afraid of the dark. I looked to Kroll and nodded, shaking his hand. He smiled and said, "Welcome to Detachment Echo, Sergeant Blaukovich."